The rain fell in a cold, relentless sheet, turning the village square into a mire of mud and judgment. Elara knelt, the hem of her coarse woolen dress soaking through, the chill seeping into her bones like a fatal sickness. It was a cold that had little to do with the autumn air and everything to do with the 100 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. They were eyes she had known her entire life. Neighbors, merchants, the baker's wife, the blacksmith's children. But now they were the eyes of strangers, hard and unforgiving as granite. The murmurs of the crowd were a cruel tide, rising and falling with whispers of insolence, ruin, and shame. Her father had been dead only 2 months. His strong presence the only shield she had ever known against the grasping ambitions of men like Aldrich, the village elder. Now that shield was gone, and she was exposed, a lone sapling in a harsh wind. Aldrich stood before her on the raised platform, his face a mask of sanctimonious pity that failed to conceal the triumph glittering in his small, dark eyes. He had coveted her father's land, the small but fertile plot bordering his own sprawling fields. With her father gone and no brother to inherit, Elara had become an obstacle, one he was now elegantly removing. Elara? His voice boomed, falsely sorrowful, for the benefit of the assembled. You have defied propriety. You have refused a respectable match, and by your willfulness, you have brought dishonor upon this community. He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the crowd. But we are a merciful people. You will not be cast out. Instead, you will be joined in union. You will learn humility. You will learn obedience. A ripple of anticipation went through the villagers. Her punishment was to be a marriage, a public binding that would serve as a living lesson. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She raised her eyes not to Aldrich, but to the edge of the crowd where he was being brought forward. He was the village's ghost, a man who lived on the far rim of the valley, seen only on rare occasions when he came for salt and flour, a silent wraith who traded pelts for necessities and then vanished back into the woods. They called him Silas. He was tall but shockingly thin, his frame all sharp angles and sinew, as if carved from weathered wood. His face was gaunt, defined by high cheekbones and a strong jaw shadowed with neglect, but his eyes were a startling gray, clear and steady, and they held no judgment. They simply observed. He was dressed in patched leather and homespun that had seen better days, and he clutched no property but a small satchel. Poor and skinny man. This was her sentence. To be shackled to a specter, a nobody, and banished from the only world she had ever known. The laughter that followed Aldrich's decree was sharp and cruel, a shower of stones upon her already bowed head. They were shaming her, breaking her, and ensuring her father's legacy would be swallowed whole. As Silas was brought to stand beside her, his presence was not threatening, merely still. He smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the mountains, a stark contrast to the cloying dampness of the village. The priest mumbled the rites, his words a meaningless drone against the roaring in Elara's ears. When it was done, a rough rope was tied loosely around her wrist, the other end held by Silas. It was not a bond of marriage, but the leash of a possession. He did not look at her. He looked past the crowd, toward the gray, brooding peaks that serrated the horizon. He was already gone, and as he gave a slight tug on the rope, a silent command to rise and follow, Elara felt the last vestiges of her old life wash away in the cold, unforgiving rain. The journey from the village was a silent one, marked only by the squelch of their boots in the mud and the sighing of the wind through the skeletal branches of the ash trees. Silas moved with an economy of motion that belied his thin frame, his long strides eating up the path that grew fainter and more rugged with every step. He held the rope, but let the slack fall between them, a symbolic tether rather than a physical restraint. Elara followed, her mind a maelstrom of fear and fury. Each step took her further from everything she had ever known, and deeper into a future she could not begin to imagine. The landscape shifted, growing wilder. The tamed fields and low stone walls of the village gave way to dense, ancient forest and the jagged upthrust of rock. The air grew sharper, colder. They crossed a rushing stream, swollen with the recent rain. The rocks were slick with moss, treacherous and slick. Silas crossed first, his worn boots finding purchase with an unnerving certainty. He turned on the opposite bank and waited, his gray eyes watching her hesitation. He extended a hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, but the gesture was simple, offered without pressure. For a moment, she stared at it, her pride warring with the practical need for safety. It would be so easy to refuse, to make this punishment as difficult for him as it was for her. But the water was cold and fast, and the thought of falling was more than she could bear. With a reluctance that felt like a physical weight, she placed her trembling fingers into his palm. His grip was firm, not crushing, and he pulled her across with a steady strength that surprised her. He released her the moment she was safely on the other side, the brief contact leaving a strange warmth on her skin. He did not speak. He simply turned and continued his trek up the winding path. The silence between them was a vast, uncharted territory. Alara had expected cruelty, or at the very least, a coarse indifference. She had steeled herself for the brutishness of a man who lived like a beast in the woods. But Silas offered none of it. His silence was not menacing. It was contained. He walked ahead, his shoulders straight, his gaze fixed on the path, clearing a low-hanging branch for her without looking back to see if she noticed. He was a creature of the wilderness, as much a part of it as the hawk circling high above or the stoic pines that clung to the mountainside. As dusk began to bleed purple and indigo across the sky, a profound exhaustion settled deep into Alara's bones. It was more than the physical toll of the journey. It was the weariness of a spirit that had been battered and broken. She was married to a man whose name she barely knew, exiled to a place she had only heard of in cautionary tales. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but there was nothing to go back to. The village had cast her out as surely as if they had put her on a raft and pushed her out to sea. Ahead, through a break in the trees, she saw the faint, golden flicker of a light. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, protected by a crescent of towering pines. It was small, built of dark, hand-hewn logs chinked neatly with clay and moss. A plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon against the darkening sky. It was not the dilapidated hovel she had imagined. There was an order to it, a sturdiness that spoke of careful hands and patient labor. A neatly stacked cord of wood, taller than a man, stood against one wall. A small, well-tended garden, now dormant for the winter, was fenced off to one side. As they approached, Silas finally dropped the rope, letting the end fall into the dirt. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, leaving her to stand on the threshold. The interior was a single room, but it was warm and dry. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the smooth wooden walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and beeswax. Like the outside, the inside was meticulously ordered. A simple bed, covered with furs, was tucked into one corner. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood near the fire. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly arranged clay pots, wooden tools, and a small, surprising collection of leather-bound books. There was a cleanliness and a purpose to the space that was profoundly at odds with the image of the wild, destitute man she had been forced to marry. Silas moved to the fire, adding another log from a basket nearby. He did not look at her, did not command her to enter. He simply created a space of warmth and left the choice to her. Alara hesitated, her hand clutching the cold wood of the doorframe. This was her prison. This small, solitary room was the boundary of her new life. Yet, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the first sharp bite of winter, and the warmth radiating from the doorway was a powerful lure. The world outside had offered her only scorn and condemnation. This small, quiet room offered, at the very least, shelter. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the tremor in her limbs, she stepped over the threshold and pulled the heavy door shut behind her, closing out the world that had abandoned her. Silas glanced at her then, a brief, unreadable flicker of his gray eyes, before turning his attention to a pot simmering over the fire. He ladled a thick, savory-smelling stew into a wooden bowl and placed it on the table. He then set down a second bowl for himself and sat. He did not invite her to eat. He simply provided. For a long while, Elara stood by the door watching him. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze focused on the fire. He was a man accustomed to solitude, wrapped in a silence so profound it seemed to have soaked into his very being. Her stomach growled, a sharp, painful reminder of her own needs. Swallowing her pride, which tasted like ash in her mouth, she walked to the table, pulled out the other chair and sat. She picked up the spoon. The stew was hot, rich with rabbit and wild roots. It was the first warmth she had felt all day that did not come from anger or fear. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against wood. In this shared, unspoken meal a fragile truce was born. The days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun and the steady rhythm of survival. Life in the cabin was stark and demanding, a world away from the softer routines of the village. Elara, who had once spent her days weaving and tending a small garden, now learned the much harder tasks of a life carved from the wilderness. She learned to haul water from the icy stream, to chop kindling with a small axe until her hands were blistered and raw, to clean and cook the game Silas brought back from his hunting trips. At first, she worked with a sullen, resentful heart, each chore a bitter reminder of her fall from grace. She saw Silas as her jailer, the silent arbiter of her punishment. Yet he demanded nothing of her. He simply did what needed to be done, and his relentless competence left a space for her to either contribute or not. He would rise before dawn, the soft sound of him stoking the fire the first thing she would hear. He would leave for hours, sometimes the entire day, and return with rabbits, a brace of grouse, or once, a small deer slung over his lean shoulders. He never announced his departures or his arrivals. He would just be gone, and then he would be there, leaving his bounty on the butchering block outside before coming in to wash the blood from his hands. He spoke only when necessary, his words as spare and functional as his movements. The weather turns, we need more firewood. The water bucket is low. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, but it was never harsh. Elara's resentment began to slowly, imperceptibly, erode, worn away by the steady, quiet decency of the man. She watched him. She watched his hands, scarred and capable, as he expertly skinned a rabbit or mended a snowshoe with practiced ease. She watched him sit by the fire at night, his attention not on her, but on a block of wood he was carving, his knife moving with a surgeon's precision. He was not the brutish outcast she had imagined. There was a deep, unshakable stillness to him, an intelligence that shone in his observant gray eyes. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, she noticed one of the floorboards near his bed was slightly raised. Curiosity, an emotion she had thought long dead, stirred within her. When he was out checking his trap lines, she knelt and worked her fingers under the edge of the board. Came up easily. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a long, narrow leather roll. Her hands trembled as she untied the thong and unrolled it. Inside, nestled in velveteen pockets, was a set of gleaming steel instruments. They were fine and delicate, unlike any tool she had ever seen. Slender scalpels, curved needles, forceps of intricate design. They were objects of immense skill and value, the tools of a learned man, a healer, a surgeon. She stared at them, the cold metal a stark contrast to the rough wood of the cabin. Who was this man? This poor, skinny outcast who possessed tools that belonged in a city, in the hands of a wealthy physician? She quickly wrapped them back up and replaced the board, her heart pounding. The mystery of Silas deepened, and with it, a new, unsettling feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. A flicker of respect. That evening, a change occurred. As Silas sat by the fire, mending a tear in his leather pack, Elara approached, her hands clutching a shirt of his she had found in need of repair. It was threadbare at the elbow, a gaping hole that she had the skill to fix. Without a word, she took her sewing kit, one of the few possessions she had been allowed to bring, and sat on the stool opposite him. She threaded her needle in the flickering firelight and began to work, her stitches small and even. Silas stopped his own work, his hands falling still. He watched her, his gaze intense, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, focused attention. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer a void between two strangers, but a shared space, filled with the soft sounds of their separate, yet parallel, tasks. She did not look up, but she could feel his eyes on her, on the careful movements of her fingers. For the first time, she felt seen not as a disgraced woman or a burden, but simply as a person performing a skillful act. When she finished, she bit the thread and held the shirt up, inspecting her work. The patch was neat, the stitches nearly invisible. She folded it and placed it on the table beside him. She expected no thanks and received none. But as she rose to put her things away, he spoke, his voice quiet. "The needle is sharp." It was not a compliment, not precisely. It was an observation, a statement of fact from one practical person to another. Yet it felt like more. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. A small bridge of understanding had been built in the quiet space between them. From that day on, the dynamic shifted. She began to anticipate the needs of the cabin, banking the fire before she went to bed so he would have hot embers in the morning, preparing a hot broth for his return from a long hunt in the cold. In return, he started leaving small things for her. A handful of late-season berries on the windowsill, a uniquely shaped river stone, smooth and gray, left on the mantel. One evening, she found a small, exquisitely carved bird sitting on her bedside stool, its wooden feathers so finely detailed they looked real. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. It was the block of wood he had been working on for nights, a gift, given without ceremony, without expectation. She looked over at him. He was tending the fire, his back to her, but she knew he was aware of her discovery. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so long absent she had forgotten its name. It was not love, not yet, but it was a kinship, a recognition of the quiet, resilient soul who shared her exile. She had been sent here to be broken. Instead, she was slowly, carefully being pieced back together. Winter arrived with a savage fury, blanketing the world in a deep, suffocating layer of white. The wind howled around the small cabin, a mournful, predatory sound that seemed to claw at the very logs. The world shrank to the four walls of their shelter, the fire in the hearth their sun, their moon, their entire universe. The enforced proximity should have been a torment, but instead, it became a crucible. The silence between them was no longer empty but filled with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, practiced grace, a domestic choreography born of necessity and mutual respect. One night, the storm reached its zenith. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and a heavy weight thudded against the roof, followed by the sickening crack of splintering wood. A massive pine branch, laden with snow, had crashed onto the cabin, tearing a hole in the roof near the chimney. Icy wind and snow immediately began to pour into their sanctuary. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his movements swift and sure. "The furs!" he commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the roar of the storm. "Bring them," while Alara scrambled to gather the heavy animal pelts from their bed. He grabbed a coil of rope and his axe. He climbed onto the table, his lean frame surprisingly agile, and hoisted himself up into the rafters. The cold was brutal, a physical blow. Snow swirled around him, melting on his skin. Alara watched from below, her heart in her throat, as he used the axe to clear the smaller debris, his silhouette a dark shape against the raging, white-flecked darkness. He worked with a furious, focused energy, his body a testament to a wiry strength that was far more effective than brute muscle. He secured the rope around a solid roof beam and then, with Alara's help from below, managed to haul the heavy, frozen furs into place, creating a temporary patch to block the worst of the storm. He dropped back to the floor, shivering, his face pale and his clothes soaked through. Without a thought, Alara rushed to the hearth, grabbing the kettle of hot water. She poured it into a basin, took a clean cloth, and began to wipe the snow and ice from his face and hands. Her touch was gentle, her concern overriding the last of her old resentments. He stood perfectly still, allowing her ministration, his gray eyes fixed on her face. In his gaze, she saw not just surprise, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never witnessed before. "You'll catch your death," she murmured, her voice tight with a fear that was entirely for him. He reached up and caught her hand, his cold fingers wrapping around hers. His touch was not possessive, but a simple human connection in the heart of the storm. "We held," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was not just about the roof. It was about them. They had faced the storm together, and they had held. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside their patched-up shelter, and in that moment, the forced union forged in shame and punishment was irrevocably transformed into a partnership, sealed not by a priest's words, but by shared survival. The thaw came slowly, tentatively, with the sweet smell of damp earth and the hesitant song of the first returning birds. The oppressive silence of the snow was replaced by the sound of dripping water and the rush of swollen streams. As the path to the valley became passable once more, a sense of unease settled over Elara. Their isolated world was about to be breached. She had not forgotten the village, or the man who had sent her here. She knew Aldrich's greed would not have been sated by her exile alone. Her father's land was still, by right, hers. One afternoon, as Silas was splitting wood, his rhythmic axe falls a steady heartbeat in the clearing, they heard the sound. It was the unmistakable jingle of a horse's bridle, a sound alien to their quiet existence. Elara's stomach clenched. Silas stopped his work, his axe held loosely in one hand, his body utterly still as he listened, his head cocked like a wolf sensing danger. 3 riders emerged from the trees, their forms bulky and menacing. Aldrich was in the lead, his face ruddy and self-satisfied. He was flanked by 2 brutish men from the village whose loyalty he had purchased with coin and promises. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, their expressions a mixture of contempt and curiosity as they took in the small, orderly homestead. "Well, well," Aldrich called out, his voice dripping with false joviality. "It seems the mountain air agrees with you, Elara. Though your choice in companionship remains as poor as ever," he sneered at Silas, his eyes cataloging the man's worn clothes and lean frame. "I've come on a matter of business, a formality. With your new station in life, you'll have no use for your father's land. I have a deed of sale drawn up, a generous offer, considering your circumstances. Just a signature is all that's needed." He produced a rolled parchment from his saddlebag. Elara felt a surge of cold fury. He had waited, letting the winter isolate and weaken her, assuming she would be broken and desperate enough to sign away her birthright for a pittance. She stepped forward, her chin held high. "The land is not for sale," Aldrich's smile tightened. "Don't be a fool, girl. You have no one to work it, no one to protect it. You have nothing." His gaze flickered to Silas again, dismissing him entirely. "And this stick figure of a husband can hardly protect you from a strong wind, let alone my claim." One of his men chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Silas had not moved. He stood by the woodpile, the axe still in his hand, his expression unreadable. He looked not at Aldrich, but at Elara, a silent question in his eyes. He was waiting for her lead. This was her fight. In that moment, she understood the gift he had given her all winter. It wasn't just shelter or food. It was strength. He had never tried to control her, and in doing so, he had allowed her to find her own resolve. "I said," Elara repeated, her voice ringing with a clarity and force that surprised even herself. "The land is not for sale. Now leave this place." Aldrich's face darkened with rage. The pretense of civility vanished. "I will not be told what to do by a disgraced woman and her beggar husband. The land will be mine." He swung his leg over his horse, intending to dismount. "We'll take the signature from you, one way or another." As Aldrich's boot touched the ground, Silas moved. He was not fast like a striking snake, but fluid and deliberate, like a rock slide. He took 2 long strides and swung the axe, not at Aldrich, but at the thick chopping block beside him. The heavy blade sank deep into the wood with a resonant thunk that echoed through the clearing, the handle quivering with the force of the blow. The message was unmistakable. It was a display of raw, controlled power that gave the lie to his gaunt appearance. Aldrich's men, who had been smirking, shifted uneasily in their saddles. Aldrich himself froze, his eyes wide. "Get off my land," Silas said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried more menace than any shout. It was the calm, flat tone of a man who had seen true violence and had no need for bluster. Aldrich, regaining a sliver of his bravado, gestured to his men. "There are 3 of us and 1 of him. Are you afraid of this scarecrow?" One of the men, goaded into action, dismounted and drew a long knife, advancing on Silas. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Silas didn't retreat. He simply pulled his axe from the block and held it loosely, his posture relaxed. The man lunged, a clumsy, brutish attack. Silas sidestepped with an almost casual grace, the knife slicing through empty air. As the man stumbled past, unbalanced, Silas reversed the axe in his hands. He didn't use the blade. He used the flat, heavy pole of the axe head, striking the man's shoulder with a short, precise blow. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and the man screamed, dropping his knife and clutching his arm, his face contorted in agony. The second man, seeing his companion so easily disabled, lost his nerve. He looked from Silas's cold, gray eyes to his whimpering friend, and then back to Aldrich, shaking his head. He would not be the next. Silas took a step toward Aldrich, the axe held at his side, its polished edge catching the sun. He was no longer the village ghost. He was a predator in his own territory, and his stillness was more terrifying than any threat. "I will not tell you again," Silas stated, his gaze locking with Aldrich's. Aldrich, for the first time in his life, knew true fear. He saw that the man before him was not poor in spirit or in strength. He was something else entirely, something ancient and dangerous. Scrambling back onto his horse, Aldrich stared at Silas, then at Alara, his face a mask of baffled fury. "What are you?" he stammered. Silas did not answer. He didn't have to. The answer was in the disciplined power of his stance, the intelligence in his eyes, and the unwavering defense of his home and his wife. Aldrich yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. He and his remaining man galloped away, leaving their injured companion moaning on the ground. The threat was over. In the sudden silence of the clearing, Alara looked at the injured man, then at Silas. His face was grim, but as he met her gaze, the hardness softened. He walked over to the groaning man. "The bone is shattered," he said, his voice once again calm and detached. He looked at Alara. "Bring me my roll, and hot water," and splints in the face of his enemy. The hidden surgeon had finally, fully, emerged. Alara ran into the cabin, her hands steady as she retrieved the oilcloth package from beneath the floorboards. She had known, suspected, but to see his skill brought into the open with such startling clarity was another thing entirely. When she returned, Silas had already cut away the man's sleeve with his hunting knife. He unrolled the instruments, their polished steel gleaming in the daylight. Aldrich's man, whose name was Thomas, stared at the tools with wide, terrified eyes. What are you doing?" he whimpered. "Setting the bone," Silas replied, his tone clinical. "If you want to keep the arm," he worked with an astonishing speed and precision. His long, thin fingers, which she had only ever seen carve wood or skin animals, moved with an innate, practiced knowledge. He probed the wound, set the fractured bone with a sharp, controlled movement that made Thomas cry out, and then began to stitch the torn flesh with a surgeon's needle, his movements economical and flawless. Alara assisted, handing him instruments, holding the splints steady, and washing the wound as he directed. She was no longer a spectator but a participant, their movements synchronized, a team bound by a shared purpose. They worked in a focused silence, the only sounds the pained whimpers of the injured man and Silas's low, calm instructions. When it was done, the arm was splinted and bandaged, a feat of medical skill performed in a forest clearing with the most basic of supplies. Silas stood and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked down at the man, his expression impassive. The break is clean. It will heal if you don't do anything foolish. Now go. Thomas, pale and sweating, stared up at Silas with a look of awe and terror. He struggled to his feet, cradling his splinted arm, and stumbled away down the path, not daring to look back. The clearing was quiet again. The axe was still on the ground, a reminder of the violence that had almost been. The blood was a dark stain on the earth. Alara looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw all the pieces click into place. The steady hands, the observant eyes, the books on the shelf, the quiet intelligence. It was not the poverty of a simple woodsman, but the deliberate asceticism of a man in hiding. "You were a doctor," she said. It was not a question. He met her gaze, and for the first time there were no walls, no veils. The guarded stillness in his eyes gave way to a profound, ancient weariness. "I was," he said, his voice quiet. He walked over to the chopping block and sat down, the tension finally leaving his body. "In a city a long way from here. I was a surgeon." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a past she could not see. "There was a nobleman's son. An accident. I did what I could, but it was not enough. The nobleman needed someone to blame. It was easier to ruin a physician than to admit that some things are beyond even a nobleman's power to fix. They took my license, my name. I was given a choice. Prison or exile. I chose this." He looked around at the clearing, at the cabin, at the vast, silent forest. "I thought it better to be a ghost in the mountains than a corpse in a dungeon." The story was told in his typical, spare fashion, but it held the weight of a life shattered by injustice. He had not been disgraced. He had been wronged. He had chosen solitude not out of misanthropy, but to preserve what was left of his honor. He had been sent to her as a punishment, a symbol of ruin, but he was a man of greater worth and substance than any she had ever known. She walked over to him and, without a word, sat down on the ground before him, leaning her back against the chopping block. She reached out and placed her hand on his knee, a simple gesture of solidarity, of understanding. He looked down at her hand, and then his own hand came to cover it. His touch was warm, and in that shared silence, surrounded by the quiet hum of the forest, the last walls between them finally crumbled into dust. In the seasons that followed, the cabin on the mountain ceased to be a place of exile and became simply home. The story of what had happened in the clearing filtered back to the village, carried by a humbled and grateful Thomas. It grew with each telling. Silas was not a hermit but a protector, not a pauper but a man of hidden, formidable skills. Aldrich's reputation, built on a foundation of bluster and greed, crumbled. People who had once jeered at Alara now averted their eyes in shame when they saw her on her rare trips to the village for supplies. She no longer walked with her head bowed, but with a quiet confidence that radiated from her like warmth from a hearth. She was not the wife of the village outcast. She was the partner of the mountain's guardian. Her life was still hard, filled with the endless labor of survival, but it was a life of her own making, rich with a purpose she had never known. She learned the names of the herbs on the forest floor not just for cooking, but for healing. Silas taught her, his knowledge of botany as deep as his knowledge of anatomy. She learned to read the sky for weather, the tracks in the mud for game. She became as much a part of the wilderness as he was. Her hands, once soft, were now strong and capable. Her spirit, once bruised, was now resilient. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them, Alara mended a shirt while Silas read from one of his worn books. She looked at his face in the firelight, the gauntness no longer appearing as a sign of poverty, but as the refined features of a scholar and a survivor. The lines on his face were carved by hardship, but also by a profound integrity. He had lost his name, his profession, his place in the world, but he had never lost himself. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met across the hearth. He offered her a small, rare smile, a slight upward curve of his lips that transformed his serious face. "The land is safe," he said. "Aldrich will not trouble you again." She knew he was right. It was not just his strength that would keep Aldrich at bay, but her own. She was no longer the vulnerable pawn in the village's cruel games. "Our land," she corrected him softly. His smile widened slightly. He closed his book, marking his place with a dried leaf. He had been her punishment, her shame. The villagers had intended to break her by binding her to the poorest, skinniest man they could find. They had sought to bury her in isolation and obscurity, but they had not understood the nature of true wealth. It was not found in fertile fields or coins in a coffer, but in resilience, in knowledge, in a quiet strength that could weather any storm. They had meant to give her a cage, but they had given her a key. They had tried to shame her with a man who had nothing, and in doing so had given her everything. Outside, the stars glittered in the vast, dark sky, cold and brilliant above the sleeping peaks. Inside, the fire burned bright and warm, a beacon of life and hope in the heart of the great wilderness, a testament to two solitary souls who had found in each other an unexpected and unshakable sanctuary.